Well, thanks all for coming and thanks for the invitation. I've got a lot to get through, so I'll get cracking. The philosophy of the event, or events, has a complex genealogy in philosophy. Even its name, singular or plural, does not go uncontested for meaning. Its many facets and perspectives have origins in Anglo-American philosophy of mind, in the process philosophies of Bergson and Whitehead, and in the ontologies of Heidegger, Deleuze, Lyotard, and more recently Badiou. It asks questions such as whether beyond or beneath the beings that make up events, people that do things, objects which cause other objects to do things, and so on, there is the independent reality of the events themselves, something we've been looking at for the last couple of days, I think. It also asks whether these events are objective or subjective, mental or non-mental. Are they individuated by their causes, their effects, so their spatio-temporal location, past, present or future, here or elsewhere? Whether they are empirical or non-empirical, actual or virtual, singular or plural, historical or natural, perceptible or imperceptible, finite or infinite, pure or impure, or are they all of these things? In this paper, I'll be examining the nature of the Deleuzian event in particular, in terms of its speeds and scales, or thresholds. How fast is an event anyway? When does an event occur? Or, on the other hand, are these, my own questions, are they rather silly? Is it a symptom of my excessively literalist imagination to think that an event could have a speed, to use such naive language? When I read, say, Ian McEwan's wonderful descriptions of temporality in his book The Child in Time, I feel somewhat barbaric in my own approach. Though his book does flirt with the idea of a physical time travel, in the end, he settles for something more psychological, more Proustian. Quote, "Think how humanized and approachable scientists would be if they could join in the really important conversations about time and without thinking that they had the final word. The mystic's experience of timelessness, the chaotic unfolding of time in dreams, the Christian movement of fulfillment and redemption, the annihilated time of deep sleep, the elaborate time schemes of novelists, poets, daydreamers, the infinite, unchanging times of childhood." Unquote. How much more there is to time and to say about time than just the question of how fast it goes, as if that could be measured against anything at all. And yet this basic question still puzzles me, as I think it does other philosophers in a more subtle manner. So I will be looking at the different theories of the event, in Deleuze and Bergson in particular, still with the view to tackling the question of the speed of an event. A part of the reason that I'm interested in speed relates to another question. Is it possible to miss an event? Are all events perceptible, at least in principle? Are there any minima and maxima to an event? Can some be too fast or too slow to be perceived? Have they anything to do with the speeds or history, or even the more extreme speeds of nature? In Alain Badiou's case, to take another example, events are only historical. They are easily missed and so consequently rare. Nature itself has no events. For Deleuze, on the contrary, events are numerous and natural, yet also imperceptible. For Bergson, finally, events are relatively rare, they being artifacts made by us, through what he calls fabulation, composed from the ubiquitous processes that surround us, be they natural, like earthquakes, or cultural, like war. Indeed, events for Bergson are both rare and common, cultural and natural. This might partly explain why events seem so relative. Action films, for example, appear as uneventful to some highbrow tastes, with nothing happening except for more explosions, more car chases, more acts of pure repetition, whilst art house films that might seem wholly uneventful to the average adolescent male viewer, that's a pretty sexist point, but can appear to others to possess a tragic quality in the very smallness of their events, Bicycle Thieves being a famous example of that. Eventhood, that is, whether a moment appears eventful or not, is not an intrinsic feature, but a relational one. And this relationality spills over into questions concerning what events are, how rare they are, whether or not they must be heroic and historical, as for Badiou, and so on. After all, even the seemingly motionless and uneventful cinema of Belle Étoile, for instance, with 11-minute-long shots that form 400-minute-long films, can be seen as hugely eventful. In all of this, I'm looking ultimately at the issue of imperceptibility in Deleuze's theory of the event. The connection between imperceptibility and the event is complex because it is mediated by its strange relationship with movement. And this is what Deleuze said in A Thousand Plateaus. It's a long quote, so I put it up there. And mostly this paper is about that quotation, actually. It's from, pages 280 to 1 in the original English edition. Movement has an essential relation to the imperceptible. It is by nature imperceptible. Perception can grasp movement only as the displacement of a moving body or the development of a form. Movements, becomings, in other words, pure relations of speed and slowness, pure affects, and that use of the word pure indicates that we are talking about the event here, are below and above the threshold of perception. Doubtless, thresholds of perception are relative. There is always a threshold capable of grasping what eludes another, the eagle's eye. But the adequate threshold can in turn operate only as a function of a perceptible form and a perceived, discerned subject, so that movement in itself continues to occur elsewhere. If we serialize perception, the movement always takes place above the maximum threshold and below the minimum threshold, in expanding or contracting intervals, micro-intervals. Like the huge Japanese sumo wrestlers, well, I didn't say sumo, I said that, the huge Japanese wrestlers whose advance is too slow and whose holds are too fast to see, so that what embraces are less wrestlers than the infinite slowness of the weight, what is going to happen, and the infinite speed of the result, what happened. What we must do is reach the photographic or cinematic threshold. Deleuze also writes on the same page that, quote, movement also must be perceived. It cannot but be perceived. The imperceptible is also the percipiendum. There is no contradiction in this, he continues. If movement is imperceptible by nature, it is so in relation to a given threshold of perception, which is by nature relative. Okay. Now I'm interested in this relativism of movement, of the event. On the one hand, there is its relativity to perception. On the other, its absolute relation to an elsewhere, as he puts it. The idea that absolute movement, an event, continues to occur elsewhere. Why must it be elsewhere? Or rather, if it is always elsewhere, how did it get to be there? Who put it there? And how is it possible for us, eventually, to perceive it there? Deleuze's own answer to this is to say it is by jumping or leaping between thresholds of perception, between different planes. By this leaping, quote, what cannot be perceived on one plane cannot but be perceived on the other. The imperceptible becomes necessarily perceived, unquote. So what are these thresholds or planes? Or rather, what examples can we use to make sense of them? Deleuze mentions the sumo wrestler, for instance, whose advance is too slow and whose holds are too fast to be perceived. But he also mentions the cinematic threshold, and this will be an important case for my own purposes later. The question of perceptibility, then, can be posed in terms of speeds and scales or thresholds. Well, let me just go back. There, the structure. The issue of scale with respect to Deleuzian time concerns rhythm and the multiplicity of events, the pulsation or rhythmicity of time. I could attempt at this point to say something sophisticated about rhythm theory, cite articles from the journal Rhythm of 1911, or from quantum physics, or from Aristotle or Agamben, and so on. But most often I found discussions of rhythm, pulsations, and so on either tend to pussyfoot around with their terms, most often giving them only metaphorical status, or take the terms head-on and seem to end up in a kind of New Age gibberish. But I'd like to keep my own paper at this level of gibberish for a moment. I'm very interested in the notion of gibberish, and especially the sound it makes, which is a kind of buzzing noise, as we'll see. Sometimes, gibberish makes more sense if you listen to it carefully, as I hope to show you soon. Indeed, this will be my own basic message. What Deleuze thinks of as natural thresholds of the perceptibility of the event are also cultural and affective, not though in a Spinozistic manner of an ethics of effect, but in a more moral attitude, perhaps. Seeing an event involves our care, our sympathy, and whether we perceive our world with patience and attention. In one respect, this paper is also about two types of philosophy of time. My old professor at the University of Warwick, David Wood, once told me how he began his own PhD toying with the idea of working on either Whitehead or Derrida and their respective philosophies of time. For a while he could not decide between the two, but eventually he ended up allying himself with Derrida alone, as he felt that the naturalism of Whitehead tended to attract a New Age type of gibberish, whereas the cultural approach of Derrida was all the more sophisticated. Derrida's philosophy was more serious, more grown up in its articulation. Those of us, like myself, who came to Warwick later, and who never bought into that idea of philosophical maturity, but who, nonetheless, didn't find the dryness of Whitehead attractive either, though there are now people who like Whitehead greatly, went on to read Deleuze or Bergson instead. And I think it is important to remember that Deleuze wrote his most important book, 1,000 Plateaus, for adolescents. His work is for fans of the Pink Panther as well as of Nietzsche. Deleuze can even find something interesting in the shallows of culture, where Benny Hill resides, as well as the high end of the biological sciences, Mallarmé or Bacon. Deleuze, I believe, encompasses both a culturalist and a naturalist, the grown-up activist and the teenage ingenue. We should always remember this before being tempted to transform him into a serious philosopher, a state philosopher like Kant, Hegel, or Heidegger. Speech is getting something off my chest there. Okay, so that was quite a long introduction. Now, Deleuze and the event. Deleuze writes, I've tried in all my books to discover the nature of events. It's a philosophical concept, the only one capable of ousting the verb to be, unquote. For Deleuze, the event is multiplicity rather than passage, be it the original time of his Proustian signs, seen in either the involuntary image of eternity or the actual eternity affirmed in art, or the crystal image of time in cinema 2, the pure and empty form of time, or ion, in difference and repetition, or the third synthesis of the Nietzschean eternal return. In each case, there is a detemporalization of time as succession. And yet, as Guattari observed, the plane of immanence does not affirm the coherence of a being, but of a process. There is still time as succession, as perceived movement. Now, another way of seeing this dilemma is to ask again, when is an event? How fast does it become? These are crucial questions for Deleuze. What conditions the movement of time? Where lies its potential? Where is it synthesized? Or how is it constituted? These are questions he asks across all his works. In particular, how is the past made from the present? How is the latter made to pass? How is the present made to go into the past, to flow? Difference and repetition talks of the paradox of the present as the need for a time in which to constitute or synthesize time, as a succession of past, present, and future. Quote, there must be another time in which the first synthesis of time can occur. This another time is another word, I think, for elsewhere. And this time cannot be time as succession, he adds. It is empty. It is the time of eternity. Pure pastness, ultimately, the event. So again, question, when does an event occur? Answer, it, a static entity, could never occur, a process. To change is to stop being. Quote, the agonizing aspect of the pure event is that it is always and at the same time something which has just happened and something about to happen, never something which is happening. It is the present as being of reason which is subdivided ad infinitum into something that has just happened or is going to happen, always flying in both directions at once. Hence, end of quote, we keep missing the event. Yet Deleuze also talks of absolute movements that can be seen at the cinematic threshold of perception. I'll return to this idea soon. For now, though, I want to look closer at the thresholds of perception and where they themselves come from. Are they natural, cultural, or metaphysical in origin, or all three? Now here is where I turn to Bergson. For Bergson, there can be no atemporal event. There are only layers or strata of processes, of other times and the times of others. And they are with us right here, though we refuse to see them. These other times seem elsewhere, but that is because we mostly suppress them. Only some processes are recognized, the ones we fabulate or narrate as events that have meaning for us. Crucial to Bergson's theory of time, then, is the exploitation of others' temporal processes, ones that we must detemporalize in order to make our lives and processes eventful. Our freedom and meaning is bought at the expense of others being made to seem unfree, uneventful. In 1922, Bergson wrote, quote, "All the categories of perception correspond, on the whole, to the choice of a certain order of size for condensation," unquote. This passage continues as follows. "The world in which we live, with the actions and reactions of its parts upon each other, is what it is by virtue of a certain choice in the scale of size, a choice which is itself determined by our power of acting. Nothing would prevent other worlds corresponding to another choice from existing with it in the same place and the same time," unquote. But though he says at the same time, I don't believe he means the same rhythm of time. Any one world is the sum or level of existence we choose to condense or contain in an act of perception. And this act of condensation is an act of containment, where an indeterminate realm is transformed in our gaze into a determinate one. Final quote. One might ask if it is not precisely to pour matter into this determinism that our perception stops at a certain particular degree of condensation of elementary events. In a more general sense, the activity of the living being leans upon and is measured by the necessity supporting things, by a condensation of their duration, unquote. Let me repeat that last line. The activity of the living being leans upon and is measured by the necessity supporting things, by a condensation of their duration. Bergson's point is that each plane of living reality has to treat other planes of existence as relatively inert in order to support their own vitality. Our time, our vitality, our events, our history, as Badiou might say, in other words, is made by an ethical act of exclusion, what creates the uneventful, the natural, the invisible, and dare I say it, the imperceptible. By contrast, a philosophy of processes, or numerous durations without any eternal substrate, allows for the possibility of spaces of coexistence, an interpenetrability that refutes the literally impenetrable logic of solid bodies in one time or another. Okay. I'm closing in on the film clips, so start to wake up again soon. So, Deleuze versus Bergson on cinema. Something along those lines, on the cinematic perception of events. In the earlier quotation from A Thousand Plateaus, Deleuze mentioned the cinematic threshold as the way to perceive the imperceptible. I also have my own motivation to use cinema in the context of mediating naturalistic and culturalist modes of difference in Deleuze's philosophy. Because film is both. It is both an objective apparatus, or automatic projection, and a subjective phenomenon through its appearance to and interference with the spectator. Here I must bring Bergson back in again. Now we all know how important Bergson is to Deleuze in this matter. Cinema simply is Bergsonian. Deleuze comes to this position by skillfully using the theory of the image in Bergson's Matter and Memory, and even Bergson's attack on cinema in Creative Evolution to Deleuze's own purpose. And there is the rub, as everyone knows. Cinema is only important to Bergson himself, in his own writings, as a model of how we misunderstand reality, how we see it as quantitative change, when in fact it is qualitative mobility. Cinema recomposes movement from immobile frames of celluloid, and this confusion of stasis for process is as metaphysically interesting as it is metaphysically confused. Here's the famous quote. This is what the cinematograph does. With photographs, it reconstitutes the mobility. It is true that if we had to do with photographs alone, however much we might look at them, we should never see them animated. With immobility set beside immobility, even endlessly, we could never make movement. In order that pictures may be animated, there must be movement somewhere. The movement does indeed exist here. It is in the apparatus. The process then consists in extracting from all the movements peculiar to all the figures an impersonal movement, abstract and simple, movement in general, so to speak. We put this into the apparatus and we reconstitute the individuality of each particular movement by combining this nameless movement with the personal attitudes. Now, note how Bergson insists on looking at the apparatus here, at cinema's origins in photography and optical projection. He does not look at the projected film images as Deleuze does, because he is interested in a different phase of the film process. By contrast, Deleuze takes a stand elsewhere, at the phenomenal end of the process, where the projected images appear and interfere with the viewer, albeit with the intention of making those images real by turning to Bergson's ontology of the image in matter and memory. Deleuze's first move in his rereading of Bergson on cinema, then, must be to ensure that the Bergsonian critique of cinema is neutralized. The cinematic illusion, for Bergson, exposes normal perception for what it is, a false movement composed from immobile, spatialized sections. Hence, cinema captures the metaphysical essence of perception as suppression, what suppresses movement here in favor of seeing false movement elsewhere. The actual movement of the apparatus is suppressed in favor of the virtual movement or event of the image. But, according to Deleuze, this artful reproduction of perception by cinema is also its correction. For while the cinematic apparatus does involve static frames being given the mobility by proxy of another's, what it gives us off of the mediating screen is still real movement, immediately self-moving images. What is given is movement, the very movement that exists above perception in the realm of pure images in matter memory, or pure events, in other words. Consequently, while the frame does give us a section, or immobile, it is a section which is mobile, not an immobile section plus abstract movement, as Bergson said, but Deleuze refutes. Furthermore, cinema eventually conquered, according to Deleuze, its own limitations through the development of montage, and montage is crucial to cinema as its temporalizing force. Nonetheless, we should take note of the sleight of hand here whereby Deleuze shifts the discussion from the celluloid frame as part of the cinematic apparatus, Bergson's sense, to the camera's framing as the scene cut, the viewed image, which Deleuze invokes. As one commentator notes with bemusement, Deleuze has done something wonderfully perverse here, as he admits. Bergson never was ambiguous about cuttings. For him, they always referred to film's individual frames, never to an editor's cuts or montage. Now, the overarching reason for Deleuze's need to shift attention away from the apparatus to the film image is because he wants to show cinema transcending its representational limitations through its imagery rather than through its physical technology. But he also renders a certain kind of movement imperceptible, I believe, by ignoring the apparatus. It is this enforced imperceptibility, this economy of attention, that I'd like to illustrate now with two examples, one taken from film, another from TV. Thinking of Deleuze's sumo wrestlers as well as Bergson's suppressed processes, these examples show, in both their narrative content and their cinematic form, the ways in which movements and events can often be missed, either by being too slow or too fast. So, I'm talking about this film Awakenings and a slowing down of the event. Awakenings is a 1990 film based on Oliver Sacks' memoir of the same name. It tells the true story of a doctor, Sacks, fictionalized as Malcolm Sayer and played by Robin Williams, who, in 1969, discovers the beneficial effects of the then new drug L-Dopa. He applies it to a set of catatonic patients who survived an epidemic from 1917, post-encephalactic something. The patients, prior to the administration of the drug, were total statues, alive but in a catatonic state. But after the drug, they are awakened from decades of being in an immobile, statuesque state. Sayer succeeds in reviving all of the patients from their immovable state. Alas, however, he finds out that later he cannot stop them from returning once again to it, no matter how much he increases the L-Dopa dosage. Now, the first half of the film shows Sayer trying to read these others before they are magically cured. He looks at their immobile life without the intervention of drugs, and he tries to become like them, to enter into their rhythm, because he discovers that in actual fact they are not immobile. They have a movement, but we can't see it. We can actually, however, enter into their rhythm by throwing a ball to them, placing a card down on the table before them, playing music or a certain kind of music to them, or calling their name, walking with them, even perhaps imagining what it's like to be them. The second half of the film, however, concerns making them move like us, or like Sayer, become down, or sped up, I should say, to our rhythm, through the use of drugs, L-Dopa, slowing them down, speeding them up to our speed. The imperceptibility of their own movements is quite mundane in Awakenings, I believe. Indeed, it is, in fact, cinematic, because what we're looking at are people around us embodying something which cinema does all the time, namely making movement out of immobility. Okay, let's have a clip where I try to do this without looking like a total idiot. About 7 minutes, so bear with me. Be patient.
Many have you found there? 5, and I believe them more. How are they? Just as you described them back then, insubstantial as ghosts. Only, I guess, many of them were children then.
Yes. Children who fell asleep.
Most died during the acute stage of the illness. Those who survived, who awoke, seemed fine, as though nothing had happened. They just didn't realize how much the infection had damaged the brain. And years went by, 5, 10, 15, before these strange neurological symptoms would appear. But they did. I began to see them in the early 1930s. Old people brought in by their children. Young people brought in by their parents. They could no longer dress themselves or feed themselves. They could no longer speak in those cases. Families went mad. People who were normal were now elsewhere.
What's it like to be them? What are they thinking?
They're not. The virus didn't spare their higher faculties.
We know that for a fact.
Yes.
Because?
Because the alternative is unthinkable.
patients have all been given their morning medication. That's good. Dr. Sarah was hoping you'd have some free time. Want to come with me, please? Yeah? Yeah.
This is one of the most beautiful arias ever written. Watch them closely for any reactions.
I'm very curious about this drug, and I wonder if you've come across anyone who might have, excuse me, Dr. Sayer. I'm curious if you've come across any patients with encephalitis.
After I'm through, Dr. Sayer, if you wouldn't mind. Well, as I was saying, by administering amyloid.
Usually simple Parkinsonian tremor, taken to its furthest extreme, would appear as no tremor at all.
You're talking to me?
Oh, yes. Imagine that you accelerated a simple Parkinsonian hand tremor to the point of immobility. Well, suppose there's a patient with all the Parkinsonian convulsions accelerated, the hand tremor, the head bobbing, ticking, quickening speech. Might they not all cave in on themselves and in effect turn a person into stone?
I don't know. Maybe.
Do you think L-Dopa would help this situation?
Dr. Sayers, right? I'm just a chemist, doctor. You're the physician. I'll leave to you to do the damage.
I like the fact that there was this comfort situation. So when you want to ask me a question, I'll just say, in my own time. Okay. Where was I? Oh, you don't need the PowerPoint at this point. But I do need light. Okay. Now, clearly this is a narrative discussing a certain question. But also the cinematic form, how the story is told, gets the same message across. The casting of Robin Williams, for instance, an agitated actor, very physical performer, who seems in all his performances to have some form of Parkinson's anyway, agitated, rhythmic, and so on. Also full of nervous tics, tremors, and a certain adolescence. It's carried out in the film that this Dr. Sayer is not very good with people, ignores what's going on around him, the events that are going on around him, for instance, protests against Vietnam, etc. He doesn't know those events, but he sees the events of these patients. And Robin Williams, of course, acting here in 1990, still seems to me as an actor to be carrying the 70s with him, his performances in Mork and Mindy basically being recreated in various different guises. So there's lots of things one could talk about. The very fact that we see the filming of the patients, and old films of the patients too, I think says something about cinema. We see the patients objectified in a uniquely cinematic manner, not only by being filmed and projected as spectacles, but by having their own temporal events condensed and suppressed by film. Now, where awakenings involve the slowing down of others, the speeding up of others to match our pace, the episode from Star Trek entitled The Wink of an Eye involves our lives being sped up to match a different one alongside us. In this episode from season 3, made in 1969, the USS Enterprise responds to a distress call from the planet Scalos. The call shows several Scalosians asking for assistance. Arriving on Scalos, however, Captain Kirk and his landing party find only an empty city, with no life forms registering on their tricorder scans. Don't ask what they are, but you ought to know. And yet the Scalosians really are there on the planet with them. The truth is that the Scalosians live in a different speed, but at the same place. They are visually imperceptible, travelling in a wink of an eye. Yet they can be heard as a strange buzzing noise when later they visit the Enterprise itself. Now, throughout this adventure, Kirk and his crew are challenged by the apparent illogic of spatial coexistence. How can they, his landing party and the Scalosians, both be and not be together on the same planet? Kirk keeps demanding the exact location of the Scalosians. When the Scalosians invade the Enterprise, seemingly to take it over, Kirk demands its return, not realizing that now it, the Enterprise, has at least 2 lives, one inhabited by Kirk and his crew, the other by the Scalosians. There need be no standoff, for they are not actually enemies. Indeed, Dila, the queen of the Scalosians, has specifically chosen Kirk to be her consort. To do this, though, she must accelerate his life by spiking his coffee. Drugs, again. It turns out, the men of Scalos are all infertile, and all she wants to do is to envelop Kirk for interpenetration to take place.
Captain.
Do you mind explaining?
Who are you?
The enemy.
You're the enemy?
Yes. You beamed me aboard yourself when you came up. Ridiculously long process, but I've taken care of it.
What have you done with my men?
Nothing.
Nothing? Spock? Scotty? This is nothing?
There's really nothing wrong with them. They are just as they have always been. It's you who are different.
Lieutenant. So, this is nothing?
They cannot hear you, Captain. To their ears, you sound like an insect. Oh, that's your description, Captain. Accurate, if unflattering. Really, there is nothing wrong with them.
What have you done?
Changed you. So you are like me now. Your crew cannot see you, or any of us, because of the acceleration.
The accelerated lives shown in Star Trek's Wink of an Eye, where they become invisible but not inaudible, and Awakenings, where they stand still, are each related, interestingly, to the phi phenomenon at the basis of cinema, where movement becomes so fast as to become invisible, to become its opposite. This is the apparatus's movement. A solid that moves, that is, bodies, actors that move across the screen, now that the movement of the apparatus has gone elsewhere. And this, to make a huge leap, I think, explains why Deleuze is interested in Benny Hill. If you didn't know, well, you should know. In an interview with Claire Parnay, the abécédaire, transcribed by Charles Stivall, Parnay asks Deleuze if going to the movies is always work, if there is no cinema for distraction. Deleuze says it's not culture, and Parnay asks if everything he does is inscribed within his work. Deleuze says it's not work, that he is simply being alert, on the lookout for something that passes, something troubling, amusing. Here Parnay says Deleuze only watches Benny Hill, and Deleuze agrees, saying that there are reasons why Benny Hill interests him. So, well, there's lots of reasons why you might be interested in Benny Hill. Firstly, everyone thinks of Benny Hill at the end. I assume, by the way, that Jill is not interested in Ernie the Milkman or anything like that, but the final sequence, in every Benny Hill episode, there is the final, what's called an undercranked sequence. The film is, the actual filming is undercranked. They film it too slowly, so that when it's projected back at the normal speed, everyone is sped up. And it is done with comic effect. But what's interesting is people think, because Benny Hill is a sexist and so on, traumatized, that he is chasing scantily clad women in these sequences. He never is. He is always being chased. But what happens is, throughout, is that the chase involves more and more people entering into his chase. They're entering after him. He is literally on the line of flight. It is a line of escape where he is drawing others into his wake at this accelerated speed. Of course, on top of that, it is a manipulation of time, and therefore Benny Hill is a time image. But I think it's a time image which is a line of flight, and clearly transgressing gender codes, you name it, it's all there. Nearly done. This running gag, which was a running gag in all his shows, is, I think, extraordinarily important because it's about undercranking. It is about the apparatus where, according to Bergson, the real movement is. But we don't recognize that. But there is always, as well, I think, in my own performance of this paper, a meta-movement, too, to be acknowledged, between high and low brow examples, as well as the movement between fast and slow. The movement between examples, high and low brow, and there's very little that comes lower than Benny Hill, cultural and natural examples, sophisticated sense and non-sophisticated gibberish, metaphorical, allegorical, and literal examples, all of the movement here, I think, involves a no place where we might find the event in its essence, in its indefinability, its mere outline, something that is only seen in the wink of an eye. So there is no need, as my old professor saw, for an opposition between Derrida and Whitehead. For even Derridean deconstruction itself can be experienced as a wink of an eye, as a glimpse, or, to use a fancy German term, Augenblick, which refers to a kind of wink of an eye. It is not a representation, but a passing presentation, a movement that perpetually crosses itself or erases itself in a dissolve. This would be both a naturalization of the culturalism of deconstruction, read as a philosophy of time, and a re-enchantment of the mundane and low-brow, of the everyday spaces and movements around us, the ones we barely look at, and consequently which seem so solid and so invisible to us. Final clip then. Cinema, like perception, condenses time, contracts events, others' events in particular. That the cliché of a time-lapse film can still disturb when it is done to us, when it is in a strange context, shows that there is more to it than just a directorial intention or a technical invention. It is also social, political, ethical. Our event, our time, needs the patience of others, just as their time and their events needs our patience and respect. That's it.